Imagine returning to your castle to find the gates barred and your own knight staring down with icy indifference. Your wife, the woman the world calls a monster, has just stripped your honor before every king in Europe. For 7 centuries, we've gasped at her hideous portrait. What if that face was the ultimate lie, a vengeful trap set by the men she destroyed? Deep within the lightless corridors of Amber's castle, where the mountain air turns thin and icy, hangs a canvas that has repelled visitors for centuries. It is not a depiction of a saint or a glorious victory, but a silent testament to a singular human deformity that defies the very notion of grace. The oil paint seems to cling to the warped features of a woman whose presence is felt long before the eye settles on the brushstrokes. Those who walk past it often quicken their pace, feeling a primal urge to look away from the grotesque geometry of her face. This is the enduring image of the woman known to history as the most hideous figure to ever grace a noble line. The woman in the frame is Margaret, the last Countess of Tyrol, a figure whose name became synonymous with the limits of physical repulsion. Her skull is rendered with a heavy, bulbous irregularity, and her ears are depicted as vast, drooping ornaments that seem to drag her spirit toward the earth. But it is the mouth that commands the most horrific attention, a gaping, asymmetrical void that earned her the cruel epithet of pocket mouth among commoners and kings alike. To gaze upon this image is to witness a direct assault on the aesthetic ideals of the 14th century, a time when physical perfection was often equated with the divine favor of the heavens. Yet, this visual nightmare served as a thick, impenetrable veil for one of the most razor-sharp minds of the Middle Ages. Behind the distended jaw and the sunken eyes lay a consciousness that operated on a plane far above the crude violence of her male contemporaries. While the lords and knights of the Holy Roman Empire sharpened their swords and polished their armor, Margaret was busy calculating the trajectories of power and the vulnerabilities of the heart. She was a woman who understood that in a world ruled by appearances, the one who is dismissed as a monster gains the ultimate advantage of invisibility. Her mind was a fortress as formidable as any peak. The year is 1318, and the political landscape of Central Europe is a jagged mosaic of shifting alliances and blood feuds. Tyrol, the mountainous heart of the continent, sits as the ultimate prize for any dynasty wishing to control the vital trade routes between the German lands and the Italian peninsula. Margaret, at the center of this storm, was never meant to be more than a passive vessel for the transmission of land and titles. The men who surrounded her, from her father to the ambitious suitors of the great houses, saw her only as a biological necessity, a bridge to be crossed and discarded in their pursuit of total dominion. They underestimated the daughter of Henry of Bohemia at their own peril, for she had spent her childhood watching the machinations of the powerful from the shadows of the court. She learned early that a whisper in the right ear could be more lethal than 1,000 archers on a battlefield. Her isolation, born from her supposed lack of beauty, became her greatest school of strategy. In the silence of her chambers, she studied the ledgers of the state and the secret genealogies of her enemies, preparing for the day when she would no longer be a pawn in their games. She knew that her face would always be her first line of defense, a distraction for the foolish. As the winter of her youth faded and the responsibilities of the crown loomed, the rumors of her appearance spread like a plague across the borders of Austria and Bavaria. The poets of the age, who lived by the patronage of men, crafted verses that exaggerated every flaw, turning a living woman into a mythological creature of pure ugliness. They described her as a beast in silk robes, a creature that the earth itself should have rejected at birth. These narratives were not merely cruel jests but deliberate political tools designed to strip her of her humanity and her right to rule. If she was a monster, then any man who took her lands would be seen as a hero. But Margaret did not retreat into the darkness of her mountain strongholds to hide from the gaze of a mocking world. Instead, she leaned into the legend of her own monstrosity, using the fear she inspired to solidify her grip on the rocky soil of Tyrol. She understood that power is not merely the ability to command armies, but the capacity to control the story that the world tells about you. By allowing her enemies to believe she was a simple-minded creature defined by her deformities, she led them into a false sense of security. She played the role they had written for her with a chilling precision, all while she prepared to dismantle their ambitions. The halls of Castle Tyrol echoed with the footsteps of those who sought to claim her inheritance, but they found themselves navigating a labyrinth of legalities and local loyalties they could not penetrate. Margaret had secured the devotion of the Tyrolean nobility not through the charm of her face, but through the shrewdness of her governance. She offered them stability in an era of chaos, protecting their interests against the encroachment of the larger empires. To the knights and merchants of the mountains, her mouth was not a deformity but a vessel of law and order. They saw past the caricature that the rest of Europe obsessed over with such cruelty. Within the sacred confines of the 14th century, a woman's worth was often measured by the softness of her skin and the symmetry of her features. Margaret rejected this metric entirely, asserting a form of sovereignty that was purely intellectual and administrative. She was a ruler who governed through the strength of her signature and the clarity of her decrees, challenging the very foundations of the patriarchal order. The disgust she elicited in foreign courts was a shield she wore proudly, a constant reminder that she would never be conquered by the lust or the traditional manipulation of men. She was the anomaly that the medieval mind could not categorize. The mystery of the portrait in Amber's castle remains unsolved to this day, acting as a gateway into a life that was as complex as it was tragic. Was she truly the gargoyle the artist depicted, or was the painting itself a weapon forged by her detractors long after she had left the world? The distortion of her skull and the exaggeration of her features seem almost too extreme to be biological reality, suggesting a deliberate attempt to erase the woman and replace her with a cautionary tale. Yet, even in this distorted form, there is a haunting quality in the eyes that peer out from the canvas, a look of profound awareness that speaks of a woman who knew her worth. To understand Margaret is to understand the nature of historical memory and the way power is stripped from those who do not fit the mold. Her story is not one of a victim struggling against her lot, but of a sovereign who reshaped the world to accommodate her presence. She moved through the corridors of her castles with the grace of a panther, indifferent to the whispers that followed her. Every decision she made was a calculated move in a game that spanned decades, involving emperors, popes, and the most ruthless princes of the age. She was the one who determined the fate of the Alps, standing as a human barrier against the tide of continental conquest. As we begin to peel back the layers of myth and malice that have accumulated over 700 years, the true face of the Countess begins to emerge from the darkness. It is a face not defined by bone and skin, but by the sharp lines of a political genius who refused to be silenced. The 14th century was a time of fire and sword, where the weak were crushed and the bold were celebrated, yet Margaret carved out a space for herself that defied every expectation. She was the silent force behind the most audacious divorces and the most controversial marriages of her time, proving that a sharp mind is the most dangerous weapon a woman can possess. The year was 1330, a season when the biting winds of the Alps seemed to whisper of coming change. In the heart of Tyrol, the ancient stones of the castle stood as silent witnesses to a union that was never meant to be a romance. At the tender age of 12, Margaret was led toward an altar that felt more like a sacrificial stone than a place of blessing. Her small frame was draped in heavy, stifling silks that smelled of cedar and old dust, a weight that symbolized the immense political burden she was forced to carry. She was the key to a kingdom, a living contract signed in blood and gold by men who cared nothing for her spirit. Her groom, Johann Heinrich of the House of Luxembourg, arrived with the arrogance of a prince who believed the world was a map drawn for his pleasure. He was a boy of limited vision and boundless conceit, a youth who saw the rugged beauty of Tyrol only as a counting house for his future taxes. To him, Margaret was an unfortunate necessity, a physical blemish on his otherwise glittering path to power. He looked at her not with the curiosity of a partner, but with the cold, calculating eye of a conqueror who finds the terrain of his new territory to be unappealing and rugged. He did not see a girl, but a stone that blocked his way to the light. The wedding feast was a hollow display of forced merriment, where the wine flowed like a crimson river through the great hall of the castle. Margaret sat at the high table, a silent statue among the shouting men and the clashing of pewter plates. She watched as Johann laughed with his boisterous companions, his eyes never lingering on his young bride for more than a second of obligatory recognition. The guests whispered behind their hands, their eyes darting toward the girl with the strange, heavy features that the candles seemed to accentuate with cruel shadows. Already, the legend of her ugliness was being woven into the fabric of the night by those she was meant to rule. In the months that followed, the castle became a battlefield of silence. Johann Heinrich, frustrated by his own intellectual inadequacies and the complexities of Tyrolean law, began to vent his anger on the one person who could not fight back with a sword. He mocked her in front of the servants, his voice echoing through the vaulted corridors as he made crude jests about her face and her form. He attempted to break her spirit by isolating her from her childhood attendants, surrounding her instead with spies who reported her every move to him. He believed that by stripping away her dignity, he could more easily seize the administrative reins of her ancestral lands. Margaret did not cry out, nor did she seek comfort in the few friends she had left. Instead, she retreated into a cold, inner sanctuary of observation. She learned to use her perceived ugliness as a mask, a screen behind which she could watch the world without being truly seen. While Johann spent his days hunting in the dense forests or drinking himself into a stupor with his foreign knights, Margaret sat by the hearth with the masters of the household. She listened to the murmurs of the stable boys, the complaints of the kitchen maids, and the subtle grievances of the tax collectors. She was absorbing the true mechanics of the state while her husband slept. The young countess discovered that the Tyrolean nobility harbored a deep and growing resentment for the House of Luxembourg. They saw Johann as a parasitic outsider who cared nothing for the ancient customs of the mountains or the welfare of the mountain folk. Margaret began to identify the key figures among the vassals, men of honor and men of greed, and she studied their desires with the precision of a jeweler examining a raw stone. She noticed which knight felt slighted by Johann's arrogance and which administrator was hiding funds from the central treasury. She was collecting the threads of a web that she would one day use to trap her tormentor. The humiliation reached a peak during a grand tournament in 1335, when Johann publicly dismissed Margaret's presence in favor of more pleasing company. He sat on the dais, radiating a false sense of majesty, while his wife was relegated to the periphery of the event. Every laugh from the crowd felt like a needle against her skin, yet her expression remained as unreadable as the mountain granite. It was during this event that she realized Johann's greatest weakness was his belief that she was too stupid to be dangerous. He mistook her silence for submission and her physical appearance for a lack of internal fortitude. As the years drifted by, Margaret's intellect sharpened like a blade being honed on a dark whetstone. She began to interject herself into the management of the estates, appearing at meetings where her presence was not expected. She would sit in the shadows, her large, distorted mouth held in a firm line, as she listened to the disputes of the local lords. When she spoke, her voice was low and melodic, a startling contrast to the face that everyone found so repellent. She offered solutions that were far more practical and sophisticated than anything Johann could conceive, slowly earning the grudging respect of the men who actually held the power in the valleys. She began to weave a clandestine network of communication that bypassed the official channels of the Luxembourg administration. Through loyal messengers who moved under the cover of night, she reached out to the bishops and the powerful families who felt neglected by the crown. She did not ask for their help, she offered them a vision of a Tyrol ruled by someone who truly understood the land. She spoke of stability, of reduced taxes, and of the restoration of ancient rights that Johann had trampled upon. One by one, the silent players of the political game began to shift their secret allegiances toward the woman they had once mocked. Johann, oblivious to the changing tides, became increasingly erratic in his behavior. He saw conspiracies in every corner but failed to notice the one growing right beside him in the marriage bed. He attempted to assert his dominance through more aggressive means, demanding larger sums of money from the towns and threatening those who questioned his authority. His actions only served to drive the people closer to Margaret, who became a symbol of Tyrol's zero and endurance. The contrast between his loud, ineffective bluster and her quiet, methodical competence became a topic of discussion in the smoky taverns and the high council chambers alike. By the time she reached the age of 20, Margaret was no longer the frightened child who had been led to the altar. She had transformed her prison into a command center. She knew the location of every hidden path through the Alps and the secrets of every major castle in her domain. She had learned the art of the bribe, the power of the well-placed rumor, and the necessity of patience. The Cold War within the castle walls was coming to an end, not because Johann had won, but because he had already lost the hearts of the people he sought to govern. The trap was set, and the bait was his own towering ego. The air in the castle grew heavy with the tension of an impending storm as the 1340th year drew to a close. Margaret watched from her window as the sun set behind the jagged peaks, casting long, bloody shadows across the courtyard. She could hear Johann's voice below, shouting orders at a page, his tone laced with the frustration of a man who senses his control slipping away but cannot understand why. She turned back to the map spread across her table, her fingers tracing the borders of her world. The time for endurance was ending, and the time for a calculated, devastating strike was drawing near. Every night, she meticulously reviewed the pledges of loyalty she had gathered in secret, memorizing the names of those who would stand with her when the moment of truth arrived. She had turned her husband's contempt into her greatest asset, allowing him to believe he was safe in his mockery. She had transformed the castle into a theater where she played the part of the victim while directing the entire play from the wings. The world saw a woman broken by her own ugliness, but the reality was a sovereign who had mastered the most difficult lesson of all, that true power is never given, it is meticulously built. The isolation she had once feared had become her laboratory, a place where she could experiment with the loyalties of men without the distraction of emotion. She felt no love for the men who shared her name, and she felt no guilt for the plan she was about to execute. Her heart had been hardened by years of rejection, leaving only the cold fire of ambition and the desire for justice. She looked at her reflection in a polished silver tray, seeing not a monster, but a survivor whose face was a testament to the battles she had already won in the silence of her own mind. As the dawn of a new decade broke over the mountains, the stage was finally set for a move that would shock the foundations of the Holy Roman Empire. Margaret had aligned the stars of her destiny through sheer force of will and a genius for intrigue that surpassed any of her ancestors. The vassals were ready, the people were weary of the foreigner, and the Countess was no longer willing to wait. The Cold War was about to turn into a swift, surgical revolution that would leave Johann Heinrich with nothing but the memory of the woman he had so foolishly despised. The era of the pocket-mouth was about to begin in earnest. The morning of the 1st of November in the year 1341 arrived with a deceptive clarity, the frost clinging to the jagged edges of the mountain peaks like a shroud of white velvet. Johann Heinrich, feeling the surge of a predator's confidence, gathered his hounds and his most trusted huntsmen for a day of sport in the deep valleys of Tyrol. He rode out from the heavy iron gates of the castle with his chin held high, oblivious to the fact that the very ground he trod upon was already shifting beneath his horse's hooves. For him, it was merely another day of asserting his presence over a land he believed he had finally broken to his will. As the hunting party descended into the mist-covered forests, the atmosphere within the castle walls shifted with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. Margaret stood by the high narrow window of her solar, her distorted features illuminated by the pale autumn sun, watching the last of her husband's banners disappear behind a rocky outcrop. She did not speak, for words were unnecessary when the silent machinery of her ambition had been set in motion years prior. With a single, subtle nod to the captain of the guard, she signaled the start of a transformation that would rewrite the history of the Alps and stun the dynasties of the entire European continent. The heavy oak and iron gates of Castle Tyrol, which had stood open for the prince's departure, began to groan on their massive hinges. The sound of their closing was like a clap of thunder echoing through the valley, a definitive end to a decade of foreign occupation and personal humiliation. Inside, the knights who had spent years enduring Johann's arrogance moved with a new sense of purpose, securing every post and blocking every entrance with calculated efficiency. These were the men Margaret had cultivated in secret, the vassals she had won over with her sharp administrative mind and her unwavering commitment to the ancient laws of their mountain home. While the hunt continued in the distance, the servants and officials of the Luxembourg administration found themselves suddenly and quietly disarmed. There was no bloodshed, for Margaret's plan was too perfect to require the crude messiness of a massacre. She had ensured that every key ally of her husband was either isolated in the forest or rendered powerless within the stone walls. The transition was so seamless that it felt less like a rebellion and more like the natural correction of a long-standing error. The castle was no longer a prison for a supposedly ugly countess, but a fortress for a sovereign who had reclaimed her rightful place. Hours later, as the sun began to dip behind the western ridges casting long and bloody shadows across the mountain paths, Johann Heinrich returned from his sport. He was tired, bloodied from the kill, and hungry for the feast he expected to find waiting in the great hall. However, as he reached the final ascent, he found the way blocked by a line of his own former men-at-arms. The gates were barred, and the drawbridge was raised, a sight that seemed impossible to his arrogant mind. He shouted for the porters to open the way, his voice cracking with a mixture of confusion and growing fury that echoed uselessly against the cold stone. From the high battlements, the knights looked down at their former master with a chilling and absolute indifference. There were no insults hurled, no taunts to meet his rage. There was only a profound and heavy silence that spoke louder than any declaration of war. Johann demanded to see his wife, screaming Margaret's name until his throat was raw, but she did not appear. She would not grant him the satisfaction of a final confrontation or the dignity of an explanation. She remained hidden within the shadows of the keep, a phantom of power who had deleted his existence from her world with the simple turn of a heavy iron key. The realization of his predicament slowly began to seep into Johann's mind, replacing his anger with a cold and hollow fear. He turned his horse toward the other strongholds of the region, convinced that this was merely a localized mutiny that could be easily suppressed. But as he arrived at one gate after another, from the smallest watchtower to the most fortified bastion, he found the same result. Every door in Tyrol was closed to him, every bridge was razed, and every village was silent. Margaret's influence had permeated every corner of the land, creating a unified front of rejection that left the prince with nowhere to lay his head. Stripped of his gold, his retinue, and his authority, the man who had once mocked the Countess of Tyrol was forced to flee into the darkness of the mountain passes. He found himself wandering the very roads where he had once ridden in triumph, now reduced to the status of a common fugitive. The nights were freezing, and the hospitality of the land he had mistreated was non-existent. He was forced to seek shelter in the stables of sympathetic priests or hide in the brush like a common thief, his royal lineage offering him no protection against the winter wind. The humiliation was total, a physical manifestation of the political void Margaret had created. While Johann stumbled through the mountain terrain, Margaret launched the second phase of her devastating assault. She dispatched heralds and messengers to the great courts of Europe, from the papal palace in Avignon to the imperial halls of the Holy Roman Empire. The proclamations they carried were not just about the seizure of power, but about the very nature of her marriage. She announced to the world that her union with Johann Heinrich had never been a true marriage in the eyes of God or men. She claimed with icy clarity that the marriage had never been consummated because of Johann's incurable and pathetic physical impotence. This accusation was a masterstroke of psychological and political warfare, designed to strike at the very heart of Johann's masculine identity and social standing. In the 14th century, a nobleman's honor was intrinsically tied to his ability to father heirs and command his household. By labeling him as impotent, Margaret was not only seeking a legal annulment but was also publicly castrating him in the eyes of his peers. She turned him into an object of ridicule across the continent, ensuring that no other noble house would ever take him seriously again. The man who had mocked her face was now a laughingstock because of his own supposed inadequacy. The news spread through the markets of Vienna, the salons of Paris, and the cloisters of Rome like a wildfire of scandal and intrigue. The image of the powerful Luxembourg prince being cast out by his allegedly hideous wife and accused of such a shameful failure was a story that everyone wanted to believe. Margaret provided the legal framework for her claims with a precision that left the church lawyers breathless. She cited ancient precedents and gathered witnesses from among the castle staff who were willing to testify to the coldness of the royal bedchamber. She was rewriting the past to secure her future. The emotional impact of this move was calculated to cause maximum damage to the House of Luxembourg, a family that prided itself on its virility and expansionist success. Margaret's public shaming of Johann was a direct challenge to his brother, the future Emperor Charles IV, and a slap in the face to the entire dynasty. She had taken a private humiliation and turned it into a grand theater of political revenge, proving that her mind was far more dangerous than her face was supposedly repulsive. The world began to realize that the Countess of Tyrol was not a victim to be managed, but a player to be feared. Back in the valleys of Tyrol, the people celebrated the departure of the foreigner with a fervor that bordered on the religious. They saw Margaret's move as a restoration of their sovereignty and a victory for their local identity over the encroaching imperial powers. The legend of the pocket mouth began to shift once more. No longer was she just the ugly daughter of a king, she was the clever liberator of the mountains. She sat in her council chamber, surrounded by the heavy ledgers of state, and began the work of ruling alone. She had cleared the board of her first major opponent with the cold efficiency of a grandmaster. Johann Heinrich eventually found his way back to his family's lands, but he arrived as a broken and ridiculed figure. His brother and father looked upon him with a mixture of pity and contempt, his reputation forever tarnished by the accusations Margaret had hurled across the borders. He had lost a kingdom, a fortune, and his dignity to a woman he had spent a decade treating with utter disdain. He would spend the rest of his days haunted by the memory of those closed gates and the silent, judging eyes of the knights who had once bowed to him. The hunter had become the prey, and the forest offered him no sanctuary. Margaret, meanwhile, stood at the center of a new and dangerous reality. By expelling a Luxembourg prince and accusing him of impotence, she had declared war on one of the most powerful families in the world. She knew that the retaliation would be swift and severe, and that the Pope would not look kindly on a woman who took the law into her own hands. Yet, as she looked out over the sprawling valleys of her domain, she felt a sense of liberation that outweighed any fear of the future. She had broken the chains of a miserable girlhood and emerged as a woman of iron will. The year 1341 ended with Tyrol standing as an island of defiance in a sea of imperial ambition. Margaret had proved that the most powerful weapon in the world was not a sword or a siege engine, but the ability to control the narrative of one's own life. She had used her silence to build a fortress and her words to destroy a man's honor. As the snow began to fall, burying the paths Johann had used to escape, the Countess prepared for the next act of her grand drama. She was finally the master of her own castle, and she intended to keep it that way. The final image of this chapter of her life is one of absolute solitude and absolute power. Margaret sits in the darkened Great Hall, the same place where she had once been forced to endure Johann's drunken insults. Now, the only sound is the crackling of the fire and the scratch of her quill on parchment as she signs new decrees. The distorted features that the world called a monster were reflected in the golden chalice on her table, but she did not flinch. She had traded the illusion of beauty for the reality of dominion, a bargain she would make 1,000 times over to keep the crown upon her head. The year 1342 began with an act of defiance that would echo across the snowy peaks of the Alps and into the marble halls of the Vatican. Margaret, having successfully purged her first husband from her lands, did not wait for the slow, grinding gears of ecclesiastical law to grant her a divorce. Instead, she announced her union with Ludwig of Bavaria, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor. This was a direct strike against the established order of the world, a marriage of political convenience and calculated rebellion that signaled to every monarch in Europe that the Countess of Tyrol was no longer playing by their rules. This alliance with the House of Wittelsbach was a masterful move that turned Tyrol into an impregnable bastion of imperial power. By choosing the emperor's son, Margaret ensured that any military attempt to reinstate her former husband would be met with the full force of the German armies. She was no longer a lone woman defending her inheritance, she was half of a diarchy that sat at the very heart of European politics. The marriage ceremony was conducted with regal splendor, despite the absence of a presiding bishop, proving that Margaret valued the steel of her soldiers and the loyalty of her lords far more than the blessing of a distant and hostile pope. The response from the papal court in Avignon was as swift as it was devastating. Pope Clement VI, incensed by this blatant disregard for the sanctity of the sacrament, placed the entire land of Tyrol under a blanket of interdict. Suddenly, the melodic chime of the church bells, which had signaled the start of every day for generations, fell into a terrifying and absolute silence. The bronze bells in the high towers were stilled by decree, and a spiritual winter descended upon the valleys. To the simple peasants who worked the mountain slopes, this silence was not merely an inconvenience, it was the audible sound of God turning his back on their country. The most horrific consequence of the Pope's wrath was the prohibition of Christian burials. In every village and town, the dead began to accumulate in barns and cellars, forbidden from resting in the hallowed ground of the churchyards. Mothers wept over the unblessed corpses of their infants, and families were forced to bury their loved ones in the middle of the night in forest clearings or beneath the floorboards of their own homes. This was a psychological terror designed to incite a rebellion, to turn the pious heart of the Tyrolean people against their countess. The Vatican expected the population to rise up in fear and demand Margaret's immediate abdication. Margaret watched the unfolding misery from the high balconies of her fortress with a face that betrayed no emotion. She saw the funeral processions that were turned away from the cemetery gates and heard the hushed, frightened whispers of the priests who dared not defy the Holy See. Many expected her to crumble under the weight of her subjects' spiritual suffering, but they did not understand the depth of her resolve. She did not see the interdict as a divine punishment, but as a political tool used by a man who had never set foot in her mountains. She decided to meet this spiritual blockade with the cold, hard reality of earthly prosperity. She summoned the leaders of the guilds and the most influential nobles to her presence in the Great Hall. Instead of offering religious platitudes or seeking their forgiveness, she opened the royal granaries and lowered the taxes that had burdened the merchant class for years. She ensured that despite the spiritual darkness, the stomachs of the people were full and the trade routes through the Brenner Pass remained safe and open. She whispered to the lords that the Pope's anger would not put bread on their tables, but her alliance with the emperor would bring wealth and stability. She was teaching her people that life could continue even when the church turned away. Her relationship with Ludwig of Bavaria proved to be a source of strength that her first marriage had never provided. He was a man of action who respected her strategic mind and relied on her deep knowledge of the Tyrolean landscape and its complex legal codes. Together, they formed a ruling partnership that was impenetrable to the schemes of the Luxembourgs or the threats of the French king. In the privacy of their inner chambers, away from the prying eyes of the world, they found a mutual understanding that bordered on genuine affection. For the first time, Margaret was not just a political asset, she was a sovereign partner in a grand, defiant experiment. As the months turned into years, Margaret began to target the wealth of the church itself within her borders. Since the clergy were forbidden from performing their holy duties, she argued that they were no longer entitled to the vast tithes and lands they held. She began to systematically seize monastic properties and redirect the funds toward the fortification of the mountain passes and the maintenance of her standing armies. It was a bold move that bordered on open heresy, but it ensured that she had the resources to withstand a prolonged conflict. She was effectively dismantling the power of Rome in her territory and replacing it with her own. The local priests were caught in an impossible position between their vows to the Pope and their loyalty to their land. Some fled the country in fear of excommunication, but many others, whose families had lived in the valleys for generations, chose to remain. Margaret offered these men a simple choice: continue their service in secret under her protection or face exile and poverty. Many chose to perform the sacraments behind closed doors, baptizing infants in secret and offering prayers for the dead in the shadows. This clandestine religious life further solidified the bond between the Countess and her people, creating a shared secret that the Pope could not penetrate. Throughout this period of spiritual shadow, Margaret's intellect remained her primary weapon of defense. She maintained an extensive network of spies in the papal court, knowing the movements of every legate before they even crossed the border. She used the gold seized from the monasteries to bribe influential cardinals and sow discord among the Pope's advisors in Avignon. She was not just surviving the interdict, she was actively undermining the institution that sought to destroy her. She understood that even the most sacred of offices was occupied by men who had prices and personal ambitions, and she was more than willing to pay them. The legend of the pocket mouth grew even darker in the retelling by her enemies during these years of isolation. They claimed that her physical appearance was a manifestation of the curse she had brought upon Tyrol, a sign of her inner corruption. They wrote of how her jaw had grown even more distorted as she defied the heavens, a grotesque fantasy designed to alienate her from the Catholic world. But Margaret only used these rumors to her advantage, appearing in public with a regal indifference that made the story seem like the desperate ramblings of those who had failed to conquer her. She knew that power was the only beauty that mattered. Her husband Ludwig stood by her through every storm, his presence a constant reminder of the emperor's shadow over the land. Together they oversaw the construction of new trade routes and the expansion of the silver mines that fueled the Tyrolean economy to new heights. They were building a state that was modernized and efficient, a proto-nation that functioned perfectly outside the traditional feudal religious hierarchy. Margaret's administration was so effective that even her harshest critics were forced to admit that she was a more capable ruler than any of the men who had preceded her. The supposedly ugly countess was proving to be a visionary. By the middle of the 1340s, the stalemate between Tyrol and the Vatican had become a source of embarrassment for the Pope. The interdict had failed to break Margaret or her people, and her alliance with the House of Wittelsbach had only grown stronger with time. The spiritual weapons of Rome were losing their edge against the granite resolve of a woman who refused to believe she was inferior to any man. She had transformed her small mountain domain into a center of resistance, a place where the rules of the Middle Ages were being rewritten by the sheer force of a single woman's iron will. There was an undeniable aura of mystery surrounding her life during this period of her reign. She spent hours in the high towers of her castle, studying the stars and the ancient texts of the Greeks, seeking a wisdom that the Church could not provide. Some whispered that she was practicing the dark arts to keep the plague from her borders, but the truth was more mundane and far more dangerous. She was learning to think for herself. She realized that the structure of the medieval world was artificial, a series of layers designed to keep the powerful in place. Having been cast out by that structure, she felt no obligation to its sanctity. The final months of this era of defiance were marked by a series of failed diplomatic missions from the papal legates. Every time an official arrived at the border with new demands for her submission, Margaret met them with a cold list of her own conditions for peace. She demanded the official recognition of her marriage and the lifting of the interdict as a prerequisite for any further discussion of her return to the fold. She was not begging for a place in the Church, she was negotiating as an equal sovereign. Her stance was a revolutionary moment in the history of female power, a refusal to accept the spiritual blackmail of Rome. As she walked through the silent streets of her capital, Margaret could see the resilience in the eyes of her subjects. They had lived in a cursed land for nearly a decade, and yet they were alive, they were well-fed, and they were free from the influence of the Luxembourgs. She had given them a sense of dignity that was not dependent on the approval of a foreign priest. The bells might have been silent in the towers, but the heartbeat of Tyrol was stronger than ever. She had survived the greatest spiritual storm of the century, and she had done so without ever lowering her head or hiding her face from the world she ruled. The chapter of the interdict would eventually come to an end, but the scars it left on the relationship between Margaret and the Church would never fully heal. She had seen the limits of their power and the unexpected strength of her own. She was no longer just the daughter of a king or the wife of an emperor's son, she was the Countess of Tyrol, a woman who had looked into the abyss of excommunication and smiled back. The world would continue to call her a monster in their chronicles, but in the shadows of the Alps, she was something far more terrifying. She was a woman who had mastered her own destiny. Looking back at those years of spiritual exile, one can see the true measure of Margaret's character. She turned a sentence of eternal damnation into a period of unprecedented growth and independence for her domain. She proved that the geography of the soul is as rugged as the mountains she ruled, and that no edict can truly touch a mind that is clear and a heart that is cold. The silence of the bells became her greatest anthem, a soundless declaration of her triumph over the expectations of her age. Margaret Maltash had not just survived the wrath of the Church, she had redefined what it meant to rule in the face of God. The final image of her triumph was her appearance at the Great Council of the Empire, where she sat beside Ludwig as an equal. Her face, though still the subject of cruel jokes in the corners of the room, held a power that silenced those who dared to look her in the eye. She had successfully navigated the most dangerous waters of the 14th century, emerging with her crown and her marriage intact. The Pope's interdict had intended to isolate her, but it had only served to make her the center of a new, defiant political world. She was the monster who had beaten the saints at their own game of power and survival. The middle of the 14th century arrived not with a celebration of progress, but with the dark wings of the Great Plague, a shadow that stretched from the ports of Italy to the highest peaks of the Tyrolean Alps. In the year 1348, the air itself seemed to turn poisonous, and the vibrant trade routes Margaret had so carefully nurtured became conduits for death. She watched from the battlements of her fortress as the fires of the plague pits lit the horizon, a grim testament to the limits of earthly power. Even as her people fell by the thousands, the Countess remained at her post, an immovable figure of granite and iron who refused to surrender her administration to the chaos of the end times. The pestilence was followed by a cruelty of nature that seemed almost biblical in its scale, as swarms of locusts descended upon the valleys, stripping the fields bare in a matter of hours. The famine that followed in the year 1349 was a slow agony that tested the loyalty of her subjects more than any papal interdict ever could. Margaret moved through her silent halls with the weight of a dying nation on her shoulders, her mind working frantically to redistribute the dwindling grain reserves. She saw the desperation in the eyes of the survivors, and she knew that her enemies were watching, waiting for the famine to achieve what their armies had failed to do for a decade. Amidst this landscape of desolation, the personal life of the Countess was struck by a series of blows that would have shattered a lesser spirit. Her husband, Ludwig of Bavaria, who had been her partner in defiance for nearly 20 years, died suddenly in the year 1361. He collapsed shortly after a meal, his face turning a dark, bruised purple as the life fled from him, leaving Margaret in a state of sudden and terrifying political isolation. The man who had provided the military muscle for her reign was gone, leaving her alone at the center of a swirling vortex of hungry dynasties and vengeful relatives who saw her widowhood as a moment of ultimate vulnerability. The mourning period had barely begun when the shadow of death returned to claim the next generation, as her children began to wither and fade like summer blooms caught in a sudden frost. Her son, Meinhard III, the last hope for the continuation of her line, died in the year 1363, leaving the Countess without an heir and without a future for her house. The silence that filled the nursery was more profound than any silence that had ever gripped the castle during the interdict. Margaret stood over the small caskets with a heart that had become a barren wasteland, the last of her bloodline extinguished in a world that seemed determined to erase her name. With the death of her heirs, the great houses of Europe began to circle Tyrol like wolves around a wounded elk, their eyes fixed on the strategic mountain passes that she still controlled. The Habsburgs of Austria, led by the ambitious and youthful Duke Rudolf IV, were the first to move, sending envoys with words of feigned sympathy and hidden threats. They believed that a woman broken by the loss of her husband and children would be an easy mark for their diplomatic pressure. They viewed her grief as a weakness and her loneliness as an opportunity to finally absorb the rich lands of the Alps into their expanding empire without firing a single shot. But those who expected to find a weeping widow found instead a strategist who had distilled her sorrow into a lethal political venom. Margaret understood that her life was now the only thing standing between the independence of Tyrol and the total domination of the surrounding powers. She began to play a game of triple intrigue that defied all diplomatic norms, engaging in secret negotiations with the Wittelsbachs of Bavaria, the Habsburgs of Austria, and the Luxembourgs of Bohemia simultaneously. She made promises that contradicted each other, signed treaties with secret codicils, and dangled the prize of her inheritance before their eyes like a shimmering, unreachable mirage. She would meet with the Austrian envoys in the morning, offering them a draft of a will that favored the House of Habsburg, only to send a midnight messenger to Munich with a different set of guarantees for the Bavarian dukes. By creating a climate of absolute uncertainty, she forced her rivals to compete for her favor rather than combining their forces against her. She knew that as long as they were suspicious of one another, they would not dare to launch an invasion. Her grief became her greatest disguise, a veil of emotional instability that she used to mask the razor-sharp calculations of a mind that was now entirely focused on the survival of her state. The Countess spent her nights in the library, surrounded by the legal archives of her family, searching for loopholes and ancient precedents that could be used to stall the inevitable. She manipulated the laws of inheritance with such complexity that even the most seasoned jurists in the empire found themselves lost in the tangled web of her decrees. She was creating a legal labyrinth that would take decades to untangle, ensuring that any attempt to seize her lands would be mired in endless litigation. Her ugliness, which the chroniclers continued to mock with increasing cruelty, became a symbol of her impenetrable nature, a face that revealed nothing to the men who sought to read her intentions. As the year 1364 progressed, the tension between the competing houses reached a breaking point, yet Margaret remained the calm center of the storm. She invited the rival lords to her court, watching with a cold, interior amusement as they vied for her attention, each believing they were the one who had finally secured her trust. She hosted banquets where the wine flowed freely and the conversation was light, all while her spies moved among the guests, gathering the whispers of their true intentions. She was the mistress of a theater of the absurd, directing a cast of kings and princes who were nothing more than puppets in her grand design. The physical toll of these years was etched into her features, making the legends of her deformity seem even more plausible to those who only saw her from a distance. Her skin grew sallow from long nights of work, and the weight of her responsibilities pulled at the corners of her mouth, yet her eyes remained as bright and piercing as those of a bird of prey. She was a woman who had transcended the need for human connection, finding her only satisfaction in the mastery of the political board. The loneliness that should have been her downfall became her fortress, a place where no emotion could penetrate to cloud her judgment or soften her resolve against her enemies. The Habsburgs began to realize that the Countess was not as easily manipulated as they had hoped, leading them to increase the pressure on her borders. Rudolf IV, a master of propaganda, began to circulate even more grotesque descriptions of Margaret's appearance, attempting to dehumanize her in the eyes of the international community. He wanted the world to see her not as a sovereign ruler, but as a withered crone who was unfit to hold such vital lands. These attacks only steeled Margaret's heart further, and she responded by quietly reinforcing her mountain garrisons and stockpiling supplies for a siege that she knew was coming, though not in the form of a physical assault. She turned her attention to the internal administration of Tyrol, ensuring that despite the chaos of the succession crisis, the courts were fair and the coinage remained pure. She understood that her power rested on the support of the local communities, and she worked tirelessly to maintain their trust even as she bartered their future to the highest bidder. She was a ruler who governed with a cold efficiency that left no room for error, her decrees reaching the furthest corners of the valleys with the speed of a falling avalanche. The people of the mountains looked to her as a steady hand in an era where the very foundations of the world seemed to be crumbling. The game of mirrors she was playing required a level of mental endurance that few humans could sustain for long. She had to remember every lie she had told, every promise she had made to a different ambassador, and every secret alliance she had forged in the dark. One slip of the tongue or one misplaced document would have brought the entire house of cards crashing down upon her head. Yet she moved through the complexities of her diplomacy with a grace that was entirely intellectual, her mind a vast archive of secrets and strategies that she guarded with the ferocity of a dragon protecting its hoard. She was the most dangerous woman in Europe because she had nothing left to lose. In the year 1365, Margaret faced a final attempt by the Bavarians to seize control of her councils. They sent a delegation of their most formidable knights and counselors, demanding that she honor her secret pledges and name them as her sole successors. Margaret met them in the great hall, standing before them in a gown of heavy black velvet that seemed to swallow the light. She did not raise her voice, but the clarity of her refusal was like a cold wind blowing through the room. She pointed out the flaws in their legal standing and the contradictions in their own demands, sending them back across the border with their pride in tatters. The isolation of the Countess was now absolute, as the last of her childhood companions and trusted advisers had been claimed by the passage of time and the recurring waves of the plague. She walked the corridors of Castle Tyrol alone, her footsteps echoing in the vast, empty spaces where the voices of her husband and children had once lived. She had become a ghost in her own home, a living relic of a time that was rapidly passing away. Yet even in this spectral state, she was the most powerful individual in the region, a woman whose signature could change the maps of the continent and the destinies of entire nations. She began to spend more time in the high mountain chapels, not seeking the forgiveness of the church she had defied, but looking out over the landscape she had saved from the fires of war. She saw the resilience of the alpine peaks and realized that her own life had mirrored their rugged, unyielding nature. She had been battered by the storms of fate and eroded by the winds of personal tragedy, yet she remained standing, a monument to the power of the human will. The Habsburgs, the Wittelsbachs, and the Luxembourgs were mere weather, passing over her for a season, while she remained the eternal master of the terrain. As the final chapters of her reign approached, Margaret prepared to make her most audacious move of all. She had exhausted her rivals, played them against each other until their treasuries were empty and their patience was gone, and now she was ready to choose the terms of her own exit from the stage. She began to draft the final documents of her reign, her hand steady and her mind clear as she prepared to hand over the keys to her world. It would be a transfer of power that no one could have predicted, a final act of intrigue that would ensure her name would never be forgotten, even if it were only remembered in whispers of horror and awe. The fifth chapter of her life ended not with a bang of drums or the clash of swords, but with the quiet scratch of a pen on parchment. Margaret Maltash, the woman the world called a monster, sat alone in the flickering candlelight, her face a mask of iron determination. She had outlived her family, her lovers, and her friends, and now she was ready to outmaneuver the very history that sought to condemn her. The wolves were still at the door, but they were no longer howling, they were waiting in silent expectation for the woman who had mastered them all to make her final, devastating move. She was the queen of a land of shadows, and she was about to step into the light of her final legend. The final chapter of the long and arduous life of Margaret of Tyrol began in the year 1363, when the heavy weight of the crown finally became too much for her weary hands to hold. She stood at the window of her great hall, looking out over the jagged mountain peaks that had been both her fortress and her prison for decades. Her children were gone, her allies were buried in the cold mountain soil, and the silence of her castle was a constant reminder of the loneliness of absolute power. She knew that her time as the sovereign of Tyrol was coming to an end, and she prepared to step into the shadows of history. With a steady hand that betrayed none of her internal exhaustion, she signed the final instruments of abdication, transferring the strategic heart of the Alps to the House of Habsburg. Duke Rudolph IV stood before her, his youthful face a mask of practiced solemnity that barely concealed the predatory triumph dancing in his eyes. He saw not a woman, but a collection of mountain passes, silver mines, and ancestral titles that were finally falling into his lap. Margaret watched him with the detached amusement of a master who had seen many such boys imagine themselves as masters of a world they did not yet truly understand. The journey from the rugged heights of her homeland to the sprawling city of Vienna was a slow and somber procession through a landscape that seemed to be mourning her departure. As her carriage descended from the clouds, the air grew thick and heavy with the scents of the lowlands, a world far removed from the sharp, clean scent of the Tyrolean pines. She moved through the gates of Vienna not as a captive, but as a ghost of a former age, a woman who had traded the noise of governance for the profound silence of exile. The crowds in the streets watched the guarded carriage pass, whispering the cruel nicknames that had followed her for years. In Vienna, Margaret settled into a residence that was comfortable but lacked the imposing grandeur of her mountain strongholds. She became a creature of habit, spending her mornings in the quiet gardens and her afternoons in a library filled with the ancient texts she had loved since her childhood. The servants noticed that she rarely looked into mirrors, not out of shame for her appearance, but out of an indifference to the physical world that had judged her so harshly. She was a mind that continued to analyze the political movements of Europe, even as her body began to fail her under the weight of 5 decades of relentless struggle and tragedy. The year 1369 brought with it a winter that seemed determined to extinguish the last embers of her vitality. As the frost etched intricate patterns on the windows of her Viennese home, Margaret felt the slow retreat of her spirit from the edges of her consciousness. She lay in her darkened chamber, the flickering candlelight casting long and distorted shadows against the walls, echoing the distorted stories that were already beginning to circulate in the courts of her enemies. She knew that once her heart stopped beating, she would no longer be able to defend the truth of her existence against the scribes of those she had defeated. It was in these final weeks that the most sinister machinery of the medieval world began to turn against her memory with a terrifying and calculated precision. The chroniclers of the Habsburg and Luxembourg dynasties, still smarting from the decades of humiliation Margaret had inflicted upon them, gathered in their scriptoriums to rewrite the past. They could not allow history to record that they had been outmaneuvered by a woman of superior intellect and unwavering will. To admit such a thing would be to confess their own inadequacy before the eyes of God and their peers. They needed a reason for their failure that was as grotesque as their wounded pride. They began to weave a tapestry of lies that focused entirely on her physical form, transforming the sovereign of Tyrol into a caricature of human repulsion. They invented the term pocket mouth, claiming that her jaw was so deformed that it resembled a shapeless sack, and they described her features as a direct manifestation of her supposed inner corruption. Every treaty she had won was reinterpreted as the result of witchcraft, and every political victory was explained away as the manipulation of a creature who was more beast than human. They were not merely writing a history, they were forging a weapon of posthumous character assassination. The most shocking revelation of this history, however, lies hidden beneath the layers of ink and centuries of academic repetition. As she lay on her deathbed, Margaret was attended by a small circle of loyal servants who saw a very different woman than the one described by the propagandists. They saw a face of refined and balanced features, a woman whose beauty had always been of a sharp, intellectual variety that intimidated the shallow men of her court. The ugliness that would become her only legacy was a complete fabrication, a psychological projection of the men who had spent their lives trying to break her and failing at every single turn. The famous portrait that would eventually hang in the halls of Amber's castle, the one that would haunt the dreams of children for centuries, was commissioned by the very men she had humiliated. They paid the artist to create a visual horror that matched the lies they were writing in their scrolls, ensuring that the world would never see the real Margaret. They wanted her to be remembered as a monster because a monster is easy to dismiss, while a brilliant woman who defies the patriarchy is a threat that can never be truly contained. The painting was not a record of her face, but a monument to their own collective and enduring spite. As the breath finally left her body in the late autumn of 1369, the scribes were already finishing the first drafts of the legend that would consume her. They burned the true portraits that had been painted during her reign, replacing them with the grotesque imagery that suited their narrative of male superiority. They erased her administrative genius, her economic reforms, and her diplomatic masterstrokes, leaving behind only the hollow image of the most hideous woman in history. They buried the real Margaret beneath a mountain of slander, confident that the world would prefer a scary story to a complicated truth. The emotional impact of this deception is a cold and bitter pill to swallow for anyone who values the integrity of the human spirit. We realize now that our collective memory of this woman is nothing more than a victory for the bullies and the losers of the 14th century. We have participated in her humiliation for 700 years, looking at her supposed face with a mixture of pity and disgust, never realizing that we were looking at a mask of their making. The outrage should not be at her deformity, but at the systematic and successful erasure of a woman's true identity by those who were too small to stand in her shadow. The fear that Margaret inspired in her enemies was so profound that they felt the need to pursue her even into the grave, reaching out across the centuries to ensure that she would never be loved or respected. They understood that the physical appearance of a woman is the most vulnerable point of her reputation in a society that values the surface over the substance. By taking away her beauty, they believed they could take away her power, reducing a sovereign ruler to a circus freak in the eyes of posterity. It was a cowardly and effective strategy that has remained largely unchallenged until the modern era of historical inquiry. Even as she was being buried in the silent earth of Vienna, the rumors of her monstrosity were already crossing the borders into France and Italy. The poets, who had never seen her, began to write verses about the beast of the mountains, and the peasants told stories of a woman whose face was so terrible it could turn the milk sour in the udders of the cows. The lie was so large and so persistent that it became a truth of its own, a foundational myth of the Tyrolean identity that Margaret had fought so hard to protect. Her legacy was stolen from her and replaced with a nightmare of someone else's design. Looking back at the ruins of her life from the perspective of the 21st century, one feels a sense of profound anger at the injustice of it all. Margaret was a woman who navigated the most dangerous political waters of her time with a grace and a cunning that should have made her an icon of female empowerment. She outplayed emperors and popes, held her lands against impossible odds, and died on her own terms in a city far from those who sought to control her. Yet, because she was a woman who dared to be more than a decorative object, she was condemned to spend eternity as a cautionary tale of physical ugliness. The unpredictable truth of her story is that she was likely one of the most remarkable women of the Middle Ages, not because of her face, but because of the sheer force of her personality and the clarity of her vision. The men who hated her were right to be afraid, for she represented a future they could not imagine, a world where a woman's worth was measured by the sharpness of her mind and the strength of her will. They tried to hide her beneath the paint and the parchment of their lies, but the flicker of her true spirit still shines through the gaps in their narrative for those who are brave enough to look for it. We must confront the fact that our fascination with her ugliness is a testament to the success of her enemies' propaganda. Every time we repeat the name Margaret the Pocket Mouth, we are completing the work of the Habsburg scribes who wanted to silence her forever. The horror of the story is not in her jawline or her forehead, but in the ease with which a woman's greatness can be translated into a physical defect by a world that is not yet ready for her. She was a genius of intrigue, a master of survival, and a visionary leader who was ultimately betrayed by the very history she helped to shape. The final silence of Margaret of Tyrol is not the silence of the grave, but the silence of a truth that has been waiting for centuries to be told. As we peel away the layers of the Habsburg lies, we find a woman who was too great to be allowed to remain human in the eyes of her contemporaries. They turned her into a monster because it was the only way they could explain why she had beaten them so thoroughly and for so long. She remains a phantom of the Alps, a sovereign whose true face we may never know, but whose brilliant, razor-sharp mind still echoes through the mountain passes she once ruled with such iron resolve. The emotion that lingers after the final page of her life is turned as a mixture of awe and fury. We feel the awe for the woman who stood alone against the world, and the fury for the world that chose to remember her as a freak rather than a hero. Margaret Maltash was the ultimate grossmaster of the medieval game, and her final move was to let her enemies believe they had won by defacing her image. She knew that the land she gave away would eventually pass to other hands, but the myth of her monstrosity would ensure that no one would ever forget her name, even if they never knew her heart. In the end, she was the victor, for her story has outlasted the dynasties of those who sought to bury her. The portrait in Amber's castle stands as a monument not to her ugliness, but to the desperate fear of the men who commissioned it. We remember her as a monster because she was too powerful to be forgotten and too brilliant to be forgiven. The tragedy of Margaret is the tragedy of every woman who refuses to be small, and her face, however distorted by the lies of time, remains the most fascinating and terrifying visage in the long, dark corridor of our shared historical memory.